Hello, it's time for another open door at 4. I'm on my phone right now sharing on some other channels here, so we'll just see who joins us. All right. So by the looks of my machine, it's just me and Chelsea right now. I'm on my phone. So we'll give it a couple more seconds before I jump in. I know last time we had some folks who missed the first question. All right, I see the eyeballs growing a little bit. So welcome back to another Open Door at 4. We're going to take some questions today. So we got several questions that came in. I am in a different location today. I actually thought I was going to be answering these questions from a parked car, but I got home in time and my machine was upstairs. So I'm in part of the living room today. But it looks like everything's broadcasting great, so we'll go ahead and dive into your questions. Now, we got a lot of questions this time, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer. Hi, Kimberly, how are you? I'm going to answer several of them, or a few of them. We're not going to take all of them today, but if I do not get to all the questions, I am going to cover some in our podcast, and so what questions we don't cover today, we'll try to cover in the podcast. And of course, if what happens today, if what you find here on the PeaceWorks Facebook page is beneficial to you, then a reminder, we do this every month for an hour in PeaceWorks University, where we answer questions and spend some time with our PeaceWorks University community. Okay, first question. I've noticed my pastor has a pattern of control over his wife, including detailed control over her appearance, where she goes, and who her friends are. He even prohibits her from interacting with people at church to the point of having designated chaperones to assure she doesn't fraternize with parishioners. She's not asked for my help, but I'm unsure what to do. Selfishly, I would like to leave the church because I don't want to sit under the preaching and leadership of a man who oppresses his wife. But at the same time, this woman's been living like this for decades. How do I approach this? Wow, that is a powerful question. There's a lot in there. First of all, let me affirm your statement that this constitutes oppression. This behavior, if you were going to pin one tactic from this question on the power and control wheel from Duluth, or the commonly held understanding of domestic violence, this would fall under isolation. I mean, obviously coercion is in here too, and manipulation, but one of the aspects of isolation I see is the forbidding interaction with parishioners, and then controlling where she goes, who her friends are, her appearance. I wish I could say that this was not a common occurrence in our churches, but I'm coming across this more and more and more. I'm not saying that it's increasing. I'm just suggesting that the disclosures, I'm getting more disclosures like this, where husbands in particular are dictating to their wives what they wear, who they talk to, and that's classic behavior for isolation. This particular pastor, and the thought that this guy is still in ministry is baffling to me. If it's this noticeable and these are restrictions that are actually placed on her, then this is very, to my opinion, contradictory to Paul's instruction to Titus regarding ministers who are not given to violence. And I would suspect, though, that if I were to challenge this pastor on his behavior, he would probably say that he's managing his family, but really what he's doing is controlling his family. A couple things for the questioner here. I mean, obviously, I'm burdened by this story, and I would want to see her receive help and be safe as well. But some key statements: she's not asked for my help, is one statement that the questioner makes. And so I would say it is difficult knowing how to approach. Depending on your relationship, the depth of your relationship would depend on whether or not you think you could approach her. And then, of course, if he's maintaining this much control over her, that would be incredibly difficult to even suggest that you be a helping hand. The questioner also says that they want to leave the church because they don't want to sit under the preaching and teaching of this man. And certainly I would not disagree with that either. I think there's definitely a pastoral problem here. This person doesn't sound qualified for ministry. And you do have to think about your spiritual health and maturity and what the effect of you setting under his teaching. And so I would not oppose you finding another church, but the main point is the safety and sanity of this pastor's wife, of this sister. Seeing the oppression, the questioner says, for decades, how do I approach it? Well, a couple things, and I don't know enough of the story to say that my suggestions are going to be the best suggestions. I'm just going to try to brainstorm with you. One thing is, if there is an opportunity to have a conversation with her, I would prayerfully consider that, and then not go into that conversation with expectations, which is something that could be very easily done, right? So you could go in expecting her to really want help, but as people helpers know, victims do not always accept help initially, or they don't feel that they're able, or they don't see the full extent of the problem. So given the opportunity, prayerfully consider offering help as by way of safety planning and discussion and connecting her to resources, individuals that could help her maybe escape or find ways to confront her husband. On an ecclesiological note, just on a church note, I'm going to take a wild guess here. And if you're on the call right now, and well, maybe you shouldn't do that if you don't want to out yourself. I want to maintain anonymity. So remember, it's a public forum that we're on. But maybe do a follow-up with Chelsea about this. I'm going to take a wild guess that the church is independent or Baptistic in nature, that there's a level of autonomy. I say that because if there's not, like if it's a denominational structure, then there should be mechanisms by which you can contact your district office, your district superintendent, or your bishop to let them know what you're observing. I know for us in my denomination, the Christian and Missionary Alliance, we're supposed to have that freedom of interacting with our district superintendent in areas of disciplinary concern. But I'm going to guess that this is an autonomous or an independent church. So the next line of defense would be the elders, deacons, or leadership. And if he's getting away with this, you're probably not going to get a whole lot of help from church leaders. If I'm mistaken and there's an ecclesiological structure you can appeal to, then I certainly would make that appeal for the sake of the ministry, because this gentleman, and let's just highlight it, you've noticed a pattern of control regarding her appearance, isolation regarding where she goes, isolation regarding who her friends are, the chaperone issue. I mean, there's all kinds of aspects here that are problematic that a wise district superintendent or bishop should be able to recognize. Now, that's no guarantee, because we know the church has really lagged behind in this issue. So, yeah, that's my best stab at it. My first attempt at it is to say, okay, if there's an opportunity to offer assistance and be a resource to this sister, then prayerfully consider how you go about that. Make sure safety is part of that, and connecting her to good, godly resources. And then secondly, if there's a way to go up the ecclesiological ladder, Certainly as a parishioner, you are within your rights and your role to report this pastor and the tactics that he's using that are unqualified, right? The aspects of his life that disqualify him from ministry. And on a side note, it's kind of a crapshoot, right? It's kind of a 50-50 with the ecclesiological ladder that I'm talking about, because there are a lot of ministers that are unqualified, and we need to do a better job as a church addressing this. But certainly if a pastor is abusing his wife, according to Titus 1, I believe, when Paul instructs Titus that pastors are to be self-controlled, temperate, and not given to violence, that there's really no room for pastors to engage in this type of behavior. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. As I said at the beginning, the outset of Open Door at 4 today, those of you who are just now joining us, we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to maybe 2 more looking at the time, and then I'm going to address what's left in our upcoming Peaceworks podcast. And so if you're not subscribed or listening to the Peaceworks podcast, you can find that on iTunes or Google Play, and you can find that at our website, chrismoles.org. It drops every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. All right, let's move on to another question. The second, abusers like to compare themselves with other abusers in order to minimize the harm they've done. And I would say this is true, but also abusers like to compare themselves to nearly everyone. And since they have such a high self-opinion, which is funny, and that's a topic for another day, but some folks would say batterers are insecure. I would say that battering produces insecurity. So there is a level of pride here that's really unprecedented. And you're right, they do compare themselves to one another. And the questioner goes on to say, saying things like, at least I never blank, at least I never did that, or at least I never, and I'll fill in some blanks. It's a blank here, but at least I never strangled you or used a weapon or locked you in a closet or whatever. Or, quote, if you see what abuse really looks like, if you want to see, what abuse really looks like, then you should see such and such. What would you say to an abuser who uses this tactic? How should a victim respond to this type of minimization? So let's start with the second half of the question. How should a victim respond to this type of minimization? I would be really hesitant to make that type of recommendation to a victim, because although this is true that most abusive individuals play the comparison game, I don't know your abuser. If you're the victim, for instance, I don't know him the way that you know him. And so I really don't know if responding to his minimization is something that you can do safely, or if responding to his minimization is something you can do that would actually help or provide accountability. So I would hesitate to say what a victim's next step should be, because I don't know that specific victim or that specific abuser. Now, I have run across this tactic a lot over the years. One case in particular, I won't give you all the details, but I was working with several men at a time, and one man in the group had described an instance where he had held his wife hostage with a weapon, and it was very graphic and very disturbing. While at the same time, another individual in the group had described an incident in which he had thrown a carton of an item, a food item, at his wife that was seemingly innocent. No one was hurt. And we were comparing the two that night in class, because the one was so graphic that it would be easy for every other guy in the group to say, well, at least I've never held my wife hostage with a weapon. Now, what was great is the other disclosure that came out that paralleled this was this, throwing something from the grocery store at her. And these two paralleled each other in such a way that one seems relatively innocent when compared to the potential damage of the other. But once we pulled the rope and talked about this, it became evident that the heart was the same. The man who held his wife hostage with a weapon wanted the same thing that the man who threw something wanted. One was more severe, possibly, as far as physical damage and impact, but they both came from a place of entitlement and pride. And so we can categorize, and it's okay to categorize and say, well, I did not do as much damage as so and so. But what's not appropriate is to say, therefore, my action is better. Hurtful behavior is hurtful, whether we think it's worse or better than so and so's hurtful behavior. Any abusive behavior must first of all be identified as abusive. If we come down on the spectrum and we say, okay, well, this was abusive and this was abusive, then there's really no comparison. You should not be using power to control your partner. And so as I play around with this comparison game with men, sometimes I confront it directly to say abuse is abuse regardless. Other times we confront it through discussion. And one of my favorite exercises that we do with men in our local corrections group is an exercise called Least Hurtful, Most Hurtful, where we draw a line on the board. And on one end of the line, we put least hurtful. The other end, we put most hurtful, and we make a Likert scale, like a 1 to 10 scale or whatever, from least hurtful to most hurtful. And then we begin discussing abusive tactics and behavior, and the guys put them on the spectrum. And they argue with each other about whether that's more hurtful or least hurtful. And we can spend really an hour arguing about what behavior is more hurtful or less hurtful. And the reality is, at the end, the exercise is really intended to show, it's a trick, right? It's a trap to show the participants that it doesn't matter how you value or devalue the behavior. The fact that this behavior is hurtful puts it off limits. This is the idea of play the comparison game all you want. It doesn't justify you. It doesn't make your actions righteous. And that's an important piece of the puzzle and something that we do quite a bit. Would I recommend a victim do that? Probably not, especially since abusers also play the comparison game with their victim, making themselves superior. It's not really an argument or a discussion that I think a victim is going to win, to be honest. But certainly you know your partner better than I ever will. Okay, I hope that helped. That's a great question. So let's do one more. Yeah, we can do one more question today at Open Door at 4, and then I will address some in the podcast. All right, number 3. How can someone keep from deep discouragement and despair when churches and believers they know are slow or simply refusing to understand and respond to the realities of domestic abuse? How can someone keep from deep discouragement and despair when churches and believers they know are slow or simply refusing to understand or respond to the realities of domestic abuse? Welcome to my world, right? I have been doing this work now for many, many years, in particular, the work of awareness and training and trying to educate the church. And it is discouraging. And I don't know that we can discount the discouragement, assuage the discouragement, or say that you won't fall into some despairing moments, because there will be people in the body of Christ, in the family of faith, who will at best minimize what you're saying, and at worst flat out deny what you're suggesting. Now, if I can in any way be a paradigm of hope, I would like for that to be the case. Because here's the deal. When I first started this work, I got involved in the work by just what was seemingly happenstance. Obviously, it was providence. God wanted me to be involved in this work. And a dear friend of mine invited me into the work, and I'm so thankful for her and the things that I've learned in this work. And so I've become passionate about it. But what I have found is that so few pastors have even been exposed to the information, the education, and so there is a huge learning curve. And I have encountered a lot of dismissal, frustration, anger from pastors and churches. But I can tell you we are making progress. So if this can be of any hope, please hear me say this. As somebody who travels, talks, writes, speaks, and engages in this work, we are making progress. 10 years ago, I often talk about how there were very few resources for domestic violence and the church. But now, my book, Leslie Vernick's books, Joy Forrest's book and workbook, Sidney Millage's book is out. Church Cares, which was a huge blessing to a lot of people, continues to be, as the Southern Baptist or the ERLC took an initiative to produce the Church Cares curriculum. So there are resources growing, blogs, websites, podcasts, more and more resources now than we've ever had before. More and more churches trying to be safe places. Last night, I taught a class. I've been teaching an online class for people helpers, and I think we have 20 some people helpers every Wednesday trying to learn and wrestle with the content because they want to go back to their churches and apply ministry responses to domestic violence. And so I know it's discouraging. I know it's heartbreaking, especially when a church that you love and people that you love do not take the problem seriously or outright dismiss you. I've experienced it. I know that it hurts, but there is a lot of good fruit being produced. And really that reminds me, it draws me back to thinking about Galatians 6, which is one of my favorite passages to teach with men and with people helpers. In the beginning of chapter 6, Paul says, brothers and sisters, if any of you, if anyone's caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore such a one and should do it with gentleness. And so I take that very seriously, that confrontational ministry, like the ministry that we do, is ordained by God. It's a responsibility of the church, and it's responsibility of mature believers. And so I should be walking in maturity, persevering, enduring, which is really the road of maturity. So enduring the disappointment, enduring the discouragement, enduring and persevering through the despair, seeing maturity produced in my life and the lives of the people that I train. For what purpose? To be a helper, to be somebody who comes alongside and bears the burden of sinners by calling them to repentance, by calling them to account, by confronting their sin. And Galatians 6 goes on to say that if we will reap a harvest if we don't grow weary, if we don't faint, right? And so don't be weary in doing good. And so there's a really a reward in perseverance. And one of those rewards is you might be rejected 3 times, 4 times, 10 times. You may work for years without the church's support, but there is a harvest to be had as people begin to be educated and enlightened and come to these conclusions that we know to be true. And that is that the church is not a safe place, but the church can become a safe place. So I know it can be discouraging, but believe me when I say things are happening at a rate that I wasn't really sure I would ever see. And I have said for a couple years that 20 years from now, we want to see the church become the safest place on the planet. And I actually think, as much as that seemed like a dream 2 years ago, I think it can become a reality because many of God's people are standing up and saying we've had enough. Okay? All right. Hey, this week on the podcast, one more time, Tuesday, 6 a.m., we'll be covering some of the questions we did not get to. Also, if this is something that you've benefited from, please consider joining Peaceworks University. Peaceworks University is our online membership site. We do this every month in more detail with more people from our community, and we would love to have you be part of that. And you can find out more about Peaceworks University at chrismoles.org. Well, thank you guys for joining us for Open Door at 4. We'll see you in a couple weeks. We'll do this again. Keep sending in questions. Comment here in the live or in the recorded video. Send questions to my assistant through the website. and we're going to look forward to seeing you guys in 2 weeks at Open Door F4.